intelligencesquared.com.
This is an MP who June of last year, resigned as a from the shadow cabinet and as an MP in order to force a by-election and bring about a wider debate on the erosion of civil liberties. This after Parliament had voted to detain terror suspects without charge for up to 42 days. Not surprising then that he's on the opposite side to Sir Ian Blair. He is, of course, David Davis.
Thank you. And just in case you think this is something from the past or from years behind us, this week alone, on Monday, the government proposed again there should be a huge database of emails, text messages, internet accesses and phone calls to be accessible without a legal warrant. That's the key point, accessible without a legal warrant. Why? Because magistrates don't understand the operational imperatives of law enforcement. That's what they said this week. Secondly, also this week, the government is now attempting again to keep that 1 million innocent people on a DNA database for 6 years, despite the fact they lost a case in the European courts, denying them that right. Thirdly, this morning, the government eventually succeeded in getting itself the right to deny an open inquest to people who have been shot by agents of the state, killed by agents of the state, or killed even as a result of negligence of the state. So it's happening now. Now, Sir Ian said he'd get his retaliation in first. And I thought, frankly, he hit himself at one point, because he started by talking about a number of things that he didn't approve of. And the phrase he used is one I'm going to remember. It was the insolence of office, because that, to a very large extent, is what we're talking about. The insolence of office, the misuse of laws designed to protect you, but actually used for the convenience of the state, the convenience and expedience of the state, which we'll come back to time and again. But before I do, I just want to pick up his one point on the DNA database. He talked about Sally Ann Bowman. He talked about the young man whose DNA was acquired as a result of getting into a fight after the crime, that tragic and vicious crime. Of course, what he didn't say was that young man actually already had a criminal record. Unfortunately, it was before the year 2000 when the law was changed to allow DNA to be taken, and because we haven't gone back and taken the DNA from criminals who were convicted before that time, we didn't have it on the database. Everybody who argues to get rid of the 1 million people from the DNA database also argues you've got to do the job properly of taking the criminal database. So a lot of this evidence that so-called evidence is put up is actually much more complex and not entirely in the interests of the proposers of this motion. Now, terrorism. Of course, we are facing a unique terrorist threat in some senses. Suicide bombers are a relatively modern phenomenon. Suicide killers are not, but suicide bombers are. It is terrifying. It's terrifying to see the bombs go off on the tubes and the buses of London, of our capital. It is a frightening circumstance. And of course, the people who do it have evil intent, and the people who suffer from it suffer very serious tragedies. But let's get it in context. The chance of death from terrorism in the last 5 years is approximately 1 in 5 million. That's 100th of your risk of death at work, a 200th of your risk from death at home, from accident at home. But perhaps more importantly, given those who argue this is a new sort of terrorism, it's half the risk for a British citizen that applied during the time of the IRA. Half the risk. Not a greater risk, a lower risk in objective terms. Now, Sir Ian told you that he wasn't, I think he said, wasn't in favour of 90 days. That wasn't the impression we got at the time when every member of Parliament was approached by his local chief of police in order to argue in favour of 90 days. Now, let me give you a flavour of the mindset that existed at the time. When we were arguing 90 days, Michael Howard and I went to see the security heads at the Cabinet Office. These are the people who were responsible for the policy and the reasoning behind the policy. And in that discussion, one of them said, well, of course, you know, if they know they're going to be in for 90 days, they'll crack sooner. And I have to say, I looked at him and said, I beg your pardon, would you repeat that? And he suddenly realised what he'd said. He said, oh, I didn't really mean that. But I'm afraid that is the mindset that attached itself to the idea of having somebody in for 90 days. And it matters a lot, that a British citizen could be held without charge for 90 days. And in case you think it's a technicality, there is actually an accidental example of this happening. It happened to a man called Lotfi Raisi. He was picked up immediately after 9/11 because the FBI identified him on a video, they thought, a CCTV video, alongside one of the bombers on 9/11. He was held under immigration law, so he wasn't, because he's an Algerian citizen, so he didn't have the advantages that you and I would have. He was held for several months, even though after 2 or 3 weeks the FBI realised they'd made a mistake, or thought they had. And in that time, he was stabbed twice in prison. He lost his job. His wife lost her job. He had a nervous breakdown, and as far as I'm aware today, he is still unemployed. That's the sort of consequence that can happen to an innocent citizen if we carried through on 90 days. Fortunately, we defeated it, but that's the consequence. And Sir Ian told you that, of course, they needed 42 days. Now, when we had that argument, we asked the police time and time again, tell us when you actually got the evidence to charge the people you held for the Heathrow plot, 5 of whom were held for 27, 28 days. Well, you know, of that 5, 3 were innocent. Innocent, and I say that advisedly. 2 were charged. We eventually found out when the information for those 2 were available. One was after 12 days, and one was after 3 days. And the one who was held for 12 days actually could have been charged on another charge because he actually had a gun with a silencer and ammunition illegally on him. So that's why we argue they didn't need 28 days. 42 days was not about security, it was about politics. And of course, the easy politics of this is to support the authoritarian argument. That was the case at the time. On ID cards, 80% were in favour. On 42 days, when we started this argument, 72% were in favour. This was an attempt to make the opposition look soft and achieve a political outcome. So that's why we had the argument. And I have to say, in our country, which is a tradition, an enormous tradition of liberty, which has informed our history, created the spirit and soul of our nation, this is important. These are issues which are too important, actually, to reduce to party politics, and they don't. Now, sometimes the proponents of this motion try to put up an Aunt Sally, that we're saying we've got a police state. Well, we haven't. But what do you call it when the government knows every email, text, phone, and internet communication you make? What do you call it when you have a million innocent people on a DNA database? What do you call it when the government can track every citizen through their car? Or when even local council can put you under surveillance? Or when you can be arrested for reading out the names of the dead at the cenotaph? What do you call it when an opposition MP is arrested for doing his job? Incidentally, on Sir Ian's watch. What do you call it when agencies of our government collude internationally in torture? What do you call it when people are put under house arrest after secret trials in which they don't know the evidence against them, and sometimes they don't even know the exact allegation against them? What would you have called it if they won the 90-day debate? And in case you just think they're quirky examples, there have been 40,000 arrests under counter-terrorism laws, including one for walking on a cycle path. Maybe that's because the lady was called Mrs. Cameron, but that's what happened. And the counter-terrorism laws have now been used against even the Icelandic banks, those well-known terrorists in Iceland. Or maybe this is late retaliation for the Vikings. So that's the country we're in. And of course, I prefer to be here than in 1950, but that's not the argument. This is an unnecessary, heavy-handed use of the state's powers. And let me just quote you something from, in finishing, quote you something from a very eminent law professor who said the following: "The 90-day, 28-day fracas is just the latest of many affronts to the rule of law. The attacks on political speech, the wide administrative discretions, the vague crimes, the expansion of proscription powers, above all, truncated legal procedures, special courts, restricted rules of evidence, security-vetted judges. The set of assumptions about the necessity of terrorism laws needs to be confronted if we're not to drift further into an authoritarian state. Society and Parliament should not be fooled by executive efforts to play the national security trump in order to end debate." A very eminent person for whom I have enormous admiration, Conor Geertzy.